Welcome to QT Academy. We're going to talk about grain line. I used to have a shop. I used to teach a lot of students. I still do actually. And I have found that knowing the personality of a fabric is very important to the ultimate outcome of the project. So let's talk about what that means. You're working with woven fabric as opposed to a knit. Woven fabric has two grain lines. You have threads that run the length and you have threads that run the width of the fabric. You may have heard the terms weft and warp of the fabric. The weft of the fabric, the weft is the width. It is the cross grain of the fabric. The warp of the fabric is the lengthwise grain. So weft or cross grain, warp or lengthwise grain. Within that, they each have their own characteristics, and that's what a lot of people don't necessarily understand, that they really do. They're really quite different. So let me show you what that means. I'm going to unroll some of this, and actually I'm going to pick up a piece here to show you on this one. It might be a little easier. Okay. On this particular fabric, you can see the selvages. If I pull on the lengthwise grain, do you hear how it snaps? That means there's no give. If you pull on the cross grain, that's what runs perpendicular to the selvages. Turn it around. I want you to look at this now because this is also on grain. Do you see that significant amount of stretch? We also know the term bias. Bias, for many people, they're familiar with it with bias binding, or if you are if you sew apparel, you are familiar with bias for other reasons. But bias is what runs at the 45-degree angle of the two grain lines, and that has the most stretch. Okay, so let's see how that affects what you do. If you're making a garment, I'm going to pull up my little friend here. If you're making a garment, you know that on a pattern piece there's an arrow, and it always says place on grain. That means, and in the directions it usually shows you, that you're placing that parallel to the selvages. When you place that parallel to the selvages, and as an example, sorry, let me do this here. As an example, when you run it that way, it could be your skirt, it could be the body of a shirt, it could be a dress. But when that arrow and that pattern piece is placed parallel, it means that it's running parallel to this selvage. When it hangs on your body, the completed garment, it won't stretch. Do you see that? That's the reason that you have those arrows and you're placing it on the lengthwise grain. What I found is that some people think that those grain lines, that little arrow, that you can place it on either grain line. If you were to place it the other way, and some people have done this and have asked me questions, if you place it the other way so that the arrow is across the grain, like this, do you see if this was a garment? It would be stretching. So as this hangs off of the body, like this, and it's a cross grain, this is going to stretch over time and become out of shape. If you cut it the correct way, where the arrow is parallel to the selvage, this is stable and it doesn't stretch. That's why you do what you do. If you were making a quilt, it also has ramifications. So let's see what that means. You know, in borders, many times you'll see cut the borders on the length of the fabric. And why do you do that? It's for the same reason. Because the outside borders, unless you're going for a special effect or a different kind of reason, or it's a pieced border, but a strip border like this, You want to cut on the lengthwise grain if possible because that's what stabilizes the outside of the quilt. There's no stretch. If you cut your borders cross grain, across the width of the fabric, and piece them together to get the length that you need, again, that means that the outside of your quilt is going to have that stretch. And many of you have run into a situation, or if you're a long arm quilter, you know that when you put that quilt onto the frame for the quilting, many times these kinds of quilts, they have fluffy ruffles on the outside edge of the quilt because they've stretched. So there is a rhyme and a reason to being asked to cut borders on the lengthwise grain, and that's for the stability of your project. That's really what I wanted to share with you. That's what I think is, really important, and sometimes we don't stop and think about what it really means, the personality of the fabric and how it affects the project. But grain line is what it's all about. So that's this session of QT Academy.